Hello again and welcome back. This is James Nussbaumer, author of The Master of Everything, a story of mankind in the world of illusion we call life. And now we will begin with Chapter 1. It's titled, Forgiveness Does Grant Freedom. I was nervously treading water, watching my boat sinking fast and without a life preserver. I could no longer swim against the current. My world was going down like the Titanic due to my own seemingly deadly errors. I was turning 50 and felt anchored to the bottom of the lake, lost for air. For many years, a transformation had been urging a shift in me, but out of fear, I resisted. I chose to remain in thick fog, thinking I was safer there. I felt as though I couldn't find my peace, so I tried on the weird belief that I could make something of myself that I was not meant to be. That was until the summer of 2007, when this overdue transformation seemed to take charge by forcing its way through the obscurity I had spent so much energy maintaining. The jolt, to say the least, gained my attention. As I see it now, this was the beginning of an undoing process that would eventually set me free. This undoing entailed the gradual, ongoing obliteration of a man-made thought system I had been buying into for most of my adult life. Later, I would learn that the parts I believed were dying in me had never really existed at all. I would learn my beliefs were nothing but an illusion, and that what is unreal surely does not live. But at that time, I felt myself drowning in a sea of disbelief, confusion, and terror. An indictment had been issued by the grand jury of the state of Ohio, and I was soon to be arrested for a selfish mistake that I made through my business practices as a financial advisor. After 25 years in business, one might think I would have known better. My actions were not a part of a Ponzi scheme, but more a brash mishandling of the money of three clients totaling approximately $100,000. Yes, you heard that right. It was $100,000, not millions or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. However, the funds were my responsibility, and tough times had left my bottom line near empty, so I did not have the ability to immediately repay the money. This angered the example-setter judge and prosecutor. I would be sent to prison. To this day, it all seems like a dream, or should I say a nightmare. Going to prison is not an easy ordeal to live with, and I surely never wish it on anyone. The authorities seized all of my material possessions, or what was left of them, and I was left penniless. All that was left of me is what seemed to be a vacant mind. I use the word vacant because the material world that had consumed me for my entire life had just vanished in an instant. I had received terrible legal advice from a lawyer who was ill-equipped to be honest enough about my case and was no match for the well-polished prosecutor and judge who wanted to be known as tough. He set an example, all right, by dishing me out a 10-year prison sentence. After I was given my sentence, a lump rose in my throat as a guard snapped handcuffs onto my wrists. My lawyer gave me a wink and a nod and then whispered into my ear that he should be able to get me an early release, but the money needed to be right, he added. He added again in his best salesman voice that my daughters should sell my house on the lake very quickly. He said a realtor would not be necessary, as he had an associate who would handle everything. He figured there might be some equity left before the seizure and garnishments were ordered. His words did not come close to rescuing me from the nausea that the fall of the gavel had produced in me. Reality slammed down hard, but my lawyer was right in that I would be eligible for an early release, and this would be a tiny bit of something that I could hang on to. Only it got worse. I later found out that I would not be eligible until I completed 5 years and 6 months in prison. And worse again, as from prison 6 months later, I read the front page news about my lawyer's death due to a drug overdose. It seems he was found face down in the winter's snow of his backyard, loaded with cocaine. Searching for a new lawyer from prison would not be an easy task unless I could get some outside help. But I had time and plenty of it. Of the people in my life, only a few had stuck with me, and those few continue to encourage me with their support. The others have chosen not to, and for those I don't even try to understand or make sense of it. In prison, it is often said, once you are sent here, you will find out quickly who your true family and friends are. Many once loved ones shy away when someone goes to prison. They all have their reasons, but it's a sad fact and it hurts. I don't mean this as an attack or an accusation toward anyone. It is merely a fact of life for a group of individuals who become destitute by being imprisoned. We are always extremely thankful for a shoulder to lean on, or cry on, or to even hug, for a good-spirited mind who may write a letter and ask, "Is there anything I can do to help you?" For those who have remained behind me and for their support, I am eternally grateful to you. The words you are listening to, or that you hold in your hand if you own this book, are about prison and life, but also about the life of the imprisonment much of the outer world lives in, with the world itself as our jailer. If the world doesn't jail us, then often we do it ourselves. It seems we have preferred bondage over freedom, but more importantly, this book is about forgiveness, so we can release ourselves from the prison we made that binds us. Forgiveness does indeed grant freedom. I'm not talking about the brave fronts that we often put on when we run around telling people that we forgive them and how much we love them. The forgiveness I'm talking about is not toward any certain individual or groups of people we may feel have harmed us. I'm talking about forgiving yourself first by overlooking the illusions you and much of the world live by. Looking beyond these illusions or untruths is the answer to peace, and that is where real love exists. The bondage I just mentioned can only be our unforgiving mind. For myself, it has always been a mind full of fear and unanswered questions. A continuous state of turmoil and misery always seemed to be just around the corner. Sure, I was trying to hide my fear and hide from it in fear, but was I really hiding? It seemed as though danger was always lurking nearby, ready to grab me. The unforgiving world, which helped us make the mind we think is who we are, sees no mistakes or errors, but only sees sins. It has eyes that see through dark glasses and wants to live, yet wishes it were dead. It wants forgiveness, and yet it sees no hope. It doesn't know how to escape and can't figure out that this prison cell we live in is not locked. The door slides open with our own true free will. I will devote this book to explaining to you how to slide that door open and walk through free. Now we go into chapter 2, and that title of the chapter is called Starting Over on a Narrow and New Lane. My lawyer had called and left a message on my answering machine to inform me a warrant had been issued for my arrest. He suggested I show cooperation and turn myself in at the county jail. But what does he know, was my first thought. I was angry about the whole mess and didn't understand why he hadn't by now worked out some sort of a deal with authorities for me repaying the money. I just could not fathom why felony charges were necessary, but my own hopelessness told me that I was finished. I could have easily turned myself in, but I needed a few days alone to gather myself, take care of unfinished business around the house, and more. After all, bail had not been set yet, and it was unlikely I would be able to come up with the necessary funds. I was just about flat broke and envisioned my immediate future, which would be housed in the county jail, awaiting a trial. I was preparing for I was preparing my mind for the inevitable. I stayed away from the house as much as possible, never knowing when a police car would show up to take me away. One evening as I was driving through the country, as I often did, taking in dusk over farmlands, going nowhere, I decided to check in on God. I went to my hometown, Massillon, Ohio, to stop in at St. Barbara's Catholic Church. I wanted to just sit for a while where I could find memories of my childhood school days. The church and school had been there for years, even before my time. In fact, my father went to the same school when he was a child. I found that the church was locked up for the night. While not so disappointed, I made a bit of humor of it by telling myself that God must have closed up shop for the day. I got back in the Toyota Camry, pushed in the Billy Joel Innocent Man CD, and headed back onto more country roads. The scenic route, I thought to myself as I sang along to the song, Keeping the Faith. I decided to pick up a pizza and a bottle of good wine and headed for home, regardless of any warrant for my arrest. After all, I'd think, why am I hiding? Unable to sleep that night, tossing and turning while the obvious was flooding my mind, I looked over to the bedside table to see the red lighted numbers on the clock. It said 2 a.m. I got out of bed, wandered to the French doors that went out onto the deck, and glanced down the slope in the backyard to the quiet lake. The full moon glistened and glowed over the calm, glass-like water. A moon like this always sent peace through me. The serene view was enough to keep my eyes on the water, and an incessant ringing in my head alerted me to the thoughts of the police who would soon be pounding on the door. There was no escaping it. What's the point of continuing to go on any longer with this charade of a life, I would tell myself and ask over and over. These dangerous types of thoughts ran through me. Still gazing down at the lake, I continued to punish myself with guilt. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I noticed a circle of ducks in the water near the boat dock, looking up the slight incline toward the house. It was odd at this time of night for ducks to be on the lake, but even odder it appeared these mallard ducks were looking directly at me. They seemed to swan back and forth as they paddled near the dock while keeping a circle formed, watching me as I watched them. It seemed as though they were aware of my presence and maybe even my mood. The starry night was warm and beautiful, so I put on my housecoat and slippers to walk out into the yard and down the slope near the dock at the lake. Sure enough, these 6 ducks were staring right at me. Certainly it was strange, but of a peaceful nature as I considered these creatures of God, simply stopping by to say hello to me. I picked up a twig and gently tossed it into the water, and they paddled away. But even as they slowly streamed away, the ducks seemed to be looking back at me until they faded into the darkness. I sat on the dew-soaked grass and continued to stare out over the lake, which was my friend. For years I'd known this lake, and I had caught many fish here. In fact, when I was a kid, a section of the property had been a fishing lot owned by my parents. And before that, an uncle and aunt had owned the property. And many years earlier, back in the 1940s, my grandparents had owned a property adjacent where my mother and her sister had spent much of their childhood on the lake, fishing, swimming, and boating. The property had passed out of the family for several years until recently I was able to purchase it along with a new house built by the previous owner. Many would say what a coincidence this was. Or was it? Thoughts like these and my memories of the lake were overshadowing my immediate pressures, and I decided to lie down and gaze out into the starry moonlight sky until I dozed off. A catnap I would allow myself, I thought. Then I entered into a dream that had only 2 characters, which were 2 different reflections of myself, each with a different shape and size, as though seen through a carnival mirror. One of me, which was the real me, had a tall, lean shape with a narrow neck and head, with an animated face. The other me was short and fat, with a round face and head that resembled that of a sumo wrestler. The real me was thrown into a dungeon and sentenced to remain there for the rest of my life. The dungeon was dark and musty, and the only time I saw anyone was once a day when the other me, a massive, unpleasant guard, opened the heavy steel door and placed a plate of food on the floor. He then would shut the door and go away. I began to rot in that dungeon for years and thought I was going mad. Finally, I made a decision. I would rather die trying to escape than spend another day in that dungeon. My plan was to wait behind the solid steel door for the guard to bring me food. When the guard opened the door, I would attack him. Because the other guard, who was me, was so strong, I, the prisoner, the other me, was sure he would overtake me and kill me. But I was fine with that. I was better off dead than being trapped forever in misery and darkness. I positioned myself behind the door. I reached over and braced myself against the door handle. When I touched the door handle, something strange happened. It began to turn. The weight of my grip made the handle move and the door cracked open. It wasn't locked. I didn't know what to do. I stepped forward and opened the door a little further. It made a loud creak. I looked into the hallway and saw the guard looking directly at me. This was strange since the guard was the other me, and it was frightening. The guard had a firm look on his face but stepped aside as I, the prisoner, walked through the door and right out of the dark dungeon into the light. That was it. There was nothing to it. That's simply I was free. I woke up in a chilled sweat and breathing rather heavily as the sun came up over the lake. Also, the ducks were back in the same circle by the dock, looking at me once again. My eyes were teary as I sat up and thought about my dream, trying to make sense of it. After sitting there a while, watching the sun reflect on the water, I realized that I had been my own prisoner. The dungeon was my own body with a false or elusive self that was guarding over everything that constitutes who I am. It was as though I had believed all along I was sentenced to my body, as if it were my prison cell. Yet the only thing that could bound me was my belief that the prison door was locked and that a frightening guard was stationed there, making sure I didn't wise up and leave, and that I must remain this way until I died. I thought to myself, man, all I need to do is change my belief in these things, and the door swings open. I have never really been under guard at all, or bound at all. I couldn't believe that all my life I'd been allowing my body to be a self-imposed limitation that kept me from who I truly am meant to be, more so who I need to be. I got up off the ground and headed back up the yard to the house, while still in awe of the morning sun over the lake. Before I opened the door to go inside the house, I looked back over my shoulder for another glance at the beautiful lake. I noticed the ducks frolicking and splashing, and their quacking sound like the laughter of small children playing. My former frenzy left me, replaced by a mood of peace and calmness. Without any thinking, the softness and gentleness of that scene in my mind sent a message to me that everything was going to be okay. It was a feeling that told me to just let go, to surrender, and I knew I needed to trust that I was merely starting over on a new path. Things and events were going to happen that simply had to be, but I would be fine. I went into the house, put on some clothes, made a pot of coffee, and sat for a while before deciding to take a walk around the lake. I filled up my large thermal coffee mug, walked out the front door, climbed the outdoor flight of 14 steps to the driveway that led upward to the street, and headed down the narrow lane that winds itself around the lake. As I sipped my morning coffee, I enjoyed the awe of nature. A wood hen hammered away in the background, and it seemed like a day the fish would be biting. I had a fresh, clean feeling without any thoughts as I strolled around the lake in an uninterrupted state of bliss. As I was approaching back toward the house, 3 deer darted out several feet in front of me, and I could see the look in their eyes. Meanwhile, the wood hen echoed again in the background. I admired the gracefulness of the deer as they leaped into the wooded acreage adjacent to the lake. I found this to be an excitement on that particular morning, I guess because of my lifelong fondness for these creatures of God. Now, about 40 or 50 yards or so from my house, I noticed a county sheriff's squad car sitting at the end of my driveway. I knew why they were there. Without any anxiety or nervousness, I walked up to the driver's side window and identified myself to the deputy. I was ready. He gently and politely handcuffed me, guided me into the back seat, and escorted me away. This was the last time I would ever see my home on the lake. Chapter 3: The Window. I resided in the county jail for 2 months due to my inability to find bail money. This is where I would remain until being bussed off to prison. I had already been escorted on at least a dozen round trips to the courthouse for various hearings. Not a very lovely trip at all, being bound in shackles, a belly chain, and handcuffs, along with a van full of others. You would think they were holding me for murder or some type of severe offense, but this is the norm for all felony cases, regardless of their nature. A prisoner is a prisoner. This particular trip seemed to be a much shorter van ride compared with my other court appearances. My guess is that I no longer felt any use for time, nor could I have to live any longer with the person I'd so desperately been trying to be for so many years. I didn't know who I was now, but I didn't care either. To the public, I was just another convicted felon. My career is finished, as well as my life, I would repeatedly mumble to myself while chained to the inside of the van on the rides back and forth to the jail. On this day before Christmas Eve, I had not yet been sentenced, but taking my lawyer's advice, I pled guilty to charges of forgery and theft that would send me to prison. I thought it was odd that there was no plea bargain. My attorney insisted that I trust him. Once back at the county jail, I noticed the young female deputy who unlocked the leg irons from my swollen ankles was about the same age as my 21-year-old daughter, Megan. While the young deputy escorted me down a long corridor leading to my cell, I briefly recalled my own headstrong 20s. But I'd never gotten into this kind of trouble I was in now. The deputy apologized and was pleasant as she gestured for me to enter the tiny cell where I would remain for at least another 30 days. I still was to be sentenced, which would mean one more round trip to the courthouse and back, and I was told that due to prison overcrowding, I would have to wait for a prison bed. During that time, a pre-sentence investigation would be performed, which would weigh heavily on the judge's decision how much prison time I would receive. I was also told that my sentence could be determined by my ability to pay fines, just like in the old Western cowboy movies, when a judge would say, "That'll be 30 days or $30. It's up to you." In my case, I was broke, and if this scenario were true, I was in hot water. The jail cell was only 6 feet wide with a concrete bench about a foot from the floor that held a torn, thin foam mattress, or what was left of one. The steel bars and concrete surrounded me securely, and being dressed in the rags they called an orange jumpsuit, I was not going anywhere. A small window was positioned near the top of the high block walls, within inches of the ceiling. That window reminded me of the window in the fruit cellar of the basement in my grandparents' old house. I found that by lying on the floor and positioned my body against the wall of that cell, I could look up through the window to see the sky. My hopes were to try anything, however slightly, to strap on to some sort of sanity. But my depression told me there was nothing to see out that window anyway, and the numbness I felt only added to the confused void that held me. The jail cell was cold, and darkness was the view through the window, just as my depressed thinking said it would be. But I did notice a hint of the glow from a nearby moon. The noise around me and up and down the long corridor of cells was horrendous, louder than a crowd in a sold-out arena, but my numbness almost managed to block it out as I half-heartedly thought of ways to end my life. A recurring thought that haunted me was, how can I live with myself? Then suddenly I became aware of what an odd thought that really was. Am I one being, or am I two? If I can't live with myself, then there must be two of me. There must be the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe only one of them is real, but how do I know which one? My supper of beans and rice on a plastic tray was slid into the cell through a slot in the bars on the floor level. I left it untouched on the floor until lights out, when I woke from a brief nap to clammy darkness. The guard came by to nab the food tray. Well, at least I thought she did. The moon had changed positions and was now squarely framed in that tiny window which my eyes grabbed onto. I now had a companion, the moon, and it remained in the window for what seemed to be a few hours. Even after it moved its position, its glow was still apparent, with a backsplash of stars like clusters filling the sky. I remember the calming, peaceful sight as I lay on the floor against the wall to gain the only available view. With my body still numb, that sky seemed very friendly. My mind would vacillate between thinking and no thinking, or the I and the self. My no thinking was merely a fixed gaze through the window and into the sky, nothing more. The thinking part of me continued its questions on how to live with myself. This side of me was getting weaker and more frightened as I began to recognize that there was nowhere as a body that I could go or hide. The more I remained on the no thinking side, the less fear I felt. Then I remembered a thought, or was it a willingness I had? It was in me, a willingness, I would say, and that was to never feel the need to hide anything. It said to let go, to just surrender of whatever is holding me to the habitual thinking that had consumed me for so long. I began having more thoughts telling me that although I was heading off to prison right now, there was nothing for me to be afraid of. But still, there were sustaining fears and self-pity I could not get a grip on, such as, why is this happening to me? And what is going to become of me? As I continued to focus through the window, an additional, brand new thought came clearly through my mind. Nothing you see from this jail cell means anything. It was my thought, my own, for sure, but I heard it as though it was talking to me. Or maybe I can say it was thinking for me. This one thought persistently hounded me through my numbness. My eyes opened widely as I suddenly realized the window was gone. The window had simply vanished, along with the cell, the bars, the concrete floor, walls, and the bench. The entire building was gone. There was nothing, only me, now sitting up in an Indian-style position with arms crossed over my legs. I was still staring at the moon and stars, and even noticed how calm I was, and yet amazed. Next, the darkness of the sky faded quickly. No sky, but oddly all its glory remained and had merged together as one light, and I felt held by it. The stars had gathered into dense groups and attached themselves to the outer edges of the moon. Now the moon was centered in an endless array of sparkling clusters, lighting up my view of the magnificent sight that welcomed me. I looked down at my feet and legs, and they were gone too. I raised my hands and arms, and they were gone. Since I had no hands to feel my face, I was convinced it no longer existed either. My entire body was gone, but I was still there. I existed, feeling a sensation all around me as the most peaceful I've ever experienced. I thought to myself, how can I feel and sense all this beauty and the light without having eyes to see with? Another sensation or thought entered my mind that said, it's okay, relax, you are already being taken care of. Plans are being made. Things and events are being arranged at this moment, getting things ready for you. You're going to do well. Next came a thought that told me all my errors were not real, so not to worry, that at that very moment, from many places, forgiveness was shining on me. It also said to let go. The emptiness and numbness were gone, along with everything else that had faded away. I've heard and read about people who have said they hear voices talking to them. For example, people who say, God spoke to me. However, with me here, this was not the case. This was more pure thought rather than a voice. So pure a thought that there was no doubting or questioning it whatsoever, and so real that it is unexplainable but is certain. A thought with no thinking. I said to myself, so this is what everything is all about. I am real regardless of my body. I went on to consider that this is what the Bible really means by there is no death, and why Jesus demonstrated there really is no death. I had always felt deep down that I was fooling myself or allowing the world to fool me. Now I was able to see how I had deprived myself by allowing my mind to buy into this fire and hell concept and the devil below. There is no such thing. Now all of a sudden the moon and stars grew so bright with light that my eyes blurred, watery with tears. As I raised my hands to wipe them, I realized everything had reappeared as if nothing had ever happened. I was sitting there, cross-legged, with all my body parts, and inside the jail cell. What I experienced was not a dream and was real, however so brief, maybe an instant. Time seemed to have suspended itself, so it didn't matter how long the experience lasted. I looked up to see the tray of food was still there. The guard had not yet picked it up. You, as well as others, have had similar type experiences, perhaps only to quickly dismiss them as a daydream or your imagination running away. Who knows how real your own experiences might have been? One thing for sure that we do know, though, is that the world is always at our side, vigilant and ready to quickly dismiss them as fantasy or delusion. Thanks for listening, everyone, and that is it for today. And the next video, we will continue with Chapter 4 of The Master of Everything. Thank you again.